Hello, everybody. I'm Bia Labate, Executive Director of Chacruna. I'm here in New York City in Cooper Union, and I'm really happy to be in New York. I have lived here when I was 10 years old, attending public school 144 in Queens with my family, so a lot of good memories. And I'm happy to be here with my new friend and colleague, Jae Sevelius, and we are attending the Horizons Conference, which is, I think, perhaps the largest conference on psychedelics in the whole U.S., excluding psychedelic sciences, which don't happen every year, but just in a few years. And this year it's sold out, and I think it's the 12th year, and it's the largest edition ever. So maybe you want to show people where we're at, and the line and this nice building up there, Cooper Union, and people are still forming in lines. And I'm here to talk about a topic that I believe it's perhaps the first time that it's been inserted in the history of this conference, which is the intersection between psychedelic science and the social justice movement. And one of the people responsible for advancing and pushing this agenda is this woman right here. So I, convinced her to talk to us. Thanks for coming today, Jae.
Thank you, Bia. It's nice to be here.
All right. So why don't you just start telling folks who are you and what do you do?
Great. Yes. I'm Jae Sevelius. I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm one of the principal investigators with the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health at UCSF, and I lead community-based research with transgender communities, looking at issues around health disparities and especially HIV, incarceration, and other issues that disproportionately affect people of color and trans people of color and trans women in particular.
Okay, so how did you get from trans studies, from California, to psychedelic science in New York? How did you make that connection?
That's a really good question, Bia. I mean, there's a lot of different answers I could give, but one of the angles is that trans people experience some of the most intense forms of trauma in our society, most pervasive forms of trauma. There's really, really high rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality in trans populations, and a lot of that has to do with transphobia and sort of like a lack of rights, a lack of understanding about the trans experience. And so, my research is a lot about increasing access to healthcare and also looking at treatments for trauma, that are accessible. And so, one of the things I'm really interested in is psychedelics for treating trauma. But I noticed when I started looking into the psychedelic literature that there wasn't a lot of acknowledgement about the most pervasive forms of trauma in our society, which are racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, these ongoing traumas that are a result of oppression and marginalization. These are also ongoing traumas. This is not something where you experience transphobia once and then you deal with it from the perspective of PTSD, dealing with a past trauma. I'm really interested in how psychedelics might help people cope with ongoing trauma, sort of develop resilience to, kind of keep going in the movement for achieving rights for everybody and equity in accessing healthcare like psychedelics for people that need it the most.
So let's say that, in one line, your original motivation to look into psychedelics was the healing potentials of psychedelics for these populations that are especially traumatized.
Yes.
And then I have been following a little bit of your path, and I'm proud to be part of that path with you. Can you talk a little bit about the first article that you published with us in Chacruna?
Sure. When I first got inspired to write about what I was observing in psychedelic science, it was a lot about feeling like some of the concepts that I've learned and used in my work with transgender communities around infusing kind of a social justice perspective into clinical research. I thought bringing those concepts to psychedelic science could be helpful. And so the first article that I wrote for Chacruna explored the concept of cultural humility. and kind of coming to understand that we all are socialized with a certain amount of privileges. We have intersecting identities that give us certain privileges, and we other identities that maybe are more marginalized. And so, coming with a perspective of humility of like, okay, I might not know everything, and it's really important to have diverse perspectives around the table, diverse people, sort of informing the decisions, informing the research, leading the research, is critical to the quality of the science that's produced.
That of course resonates with a lot for me as an anthropologist, because the whole idea of anthropology is that you look the world through other people's lenses. Like, you have to make a transition to acknowledge that reality is not just informed by your perceptions, but that there are other ways to look reality, and being in another position gives you other views of things. So the knowledge we produced is very much informed by the position we are staying at. So I think what you're saying is like, you need to bring diversity to science so that the science is also plural, because diversity helps build the way we fabricate knowledge. Knowledge is local, is contextualized, is political, is historical, and I very much appreciate that perspective. And moving a little bit forward on the ways your brain has been going and your path is going, you participated recently in our conference, Cultural and Political Perspectives on Psychedelic Science, and you gave a talk there that was very well received, and it also became an article in Chacruna called Psychedelic Justice or Injustice. Can you talk a little bit about what is that article?
Yes, yeah. That article, I think that I want to acknowledge that I've been very inspired by the work of a social justice activist named Adrienne Marie Brown. And I was really fortunate that one of my my collaborators on the research in transgender health, a really beautiful, amazing spirit, a transgender woman, introduced me to Adrienne Marie Brown's work. And she wrote this book called Emergent Strategy that has really informed my thinking around how to infuse a social justice perspective into psychedelic science. And one of the ideas that I really love is collaborative ideation. So it's about co-creating the future. So that rather than having like sort of a figurehead or a charismatic leader making all of the decisions on behalf of the entire scientific agenda or the community, we have this idea that we're envisioning the future as a collaborative. And so really starting to think about what are some structures we can put in place in psychedelic science to make it a more collaborative movement. So, for example, one of the things I'd like to talk about in my talk tomorrow is the simple idea of having a community advisory board for an organization like MAPS, for example. They don't have a community advisory board currently. There's no formal mechanism for the community to provide input into the research agenda, but I think it could be a really important addition, and it's something that in HIV research and in trans health research would be unthinkable to conduct research without a community advisory board. And it's a really nice way to acknowledge the expertise of the community and to make sure that the community has input into where the science is going.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I like very much the idea that while doing criticism and while doing social reflections and being a warrior for social justice actions, it's also very important to like have concrete solutions and offerings and volunteer your time to put those things in place, because it's much easier to criticize and to point out what is missing. So I think this is a very practical suggestion on how to move forward, and something that is not very hard to do and that is perhaps rather basic, that it's just not said and pointed out there. So I think that's a good pre announcement. We don't want to spoil the whole thing. Do you want to share any other piece of reflection that you're going to be sharing tomorrow, perhaps just as an appetizer, just to tease people's appetites?
I think the other concept that that I've really been exploring and thinking about in this context is community accountability. How do we how do we talk about our values in a way that feels good and safe and productive to everyone involved? so that there's a known community process that rests on shared values and a shared agenda, because I think it's important for us all to kind of have a more sort of structured way to think about how we move forward and how do we infuse social justice perspectives in a way that's meaningful and productive and supports the people who are doing the work on the ground.
And I know also that you're scheduled to do a webinar with MAPS. By the way, I am also playing that hat because I'm a public education and cultural specialist at MAPS. And so we're going to have a webinar series with 7 sessions starting October 17 until December 5 with hot topics in psychedelic science. And I believe that in this presentation in MAPS, in the MAPS webinar, you're going to talk more about gender issues and gender minority. Can you also give a little tease of what you're going to be talking over there?
Well, I think for that particular webinar, it's really important to have it be a little bit more of like an introduction to, transgender issues, an introduction to some of the language that is used among transgender communities. How are people thinking about gender in different age cohorts, for example, because the participants in the phase 3 trials, hopefully are going to be fairly diverse. And so I think it's important that the clinicians who are working on the phase 3 trials have a sort of a basic introduction to especially some of the more complex language that younger people are using to talk about gender, and that they know what the resources are if they do have a participant who is working with issues around gender, that they have somewhere to go to get additional information so they can really in a meaningful way support that person through their through their participation in the study.
And considering that Chacruna is like a global hub, and a lot of our audience is in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil, and we don't have that discussion so developed there, maybe can you give us, for our non-English speaking audience, a little example, 1 or 2 like juicy examples of terminology or issues that are dear to this community that you mentioned in these minorities? For example, what are the ways people talk about things that are nice or not nice? Do you know what I mean?
Like language in terms of terms? Yeah. Well, we're really, there's so much I could say about that. I think one of the biggest things that we're really seeing is that the younger generations have a much more kind of open conceptualization of gender than some of our older cohorts. I'm including myself in that, even though.
Hey, I want to know about that.
Just that, I do identify as genderqueer, and I can talk more about what genderqueer means to me, and that's a lot more about like fluidity and really challenging the concept of gender as a binary. But the younger cohorts even see it beyond like really, really outside of a binary conceptualization, where people really feel free to express gender in all kinds of ways, come up with their own terminologies to describe themselves.
That's pretty refreshing, isn't it?
It is. It's really encouraging, and it keeps me inspired, and realizing that, there's a whole multiple generations coming up behind us who are doing this work just by living their daily experience and expressing themselves, and that really inspires me.
Well, I must say that I'm already start to feeling like a little auntie, and I'm 47, and there's a time you arrive in your life that you look at the younger generations and you say, wow, I belong to another generation. I'm not a native digital. I was not educated under the internet, and I was not raised and socialized in the time where you had this, options. So thanks to our pioneer warriors that, are helping shift society, and thanks to this younger generation, kudos for these millennials and all the novelty that they are bringing. And, I just don't want to escape the en passant reference that you made to your own identity. If you don't mind sharing, what is queer and why do you feel fluid? How is that?
Well, people talk about the fact that we all have masculine and feminine energies inside of us, and we still tend to see the world through this very binary lens. We still tend to want to put people into categories, and so I resist that. I was a drag king for 10 years, so I performed on stage different types of masculinities, and really enjoyed that.
Did you have a drag king name?
It was Jae Walker.
Jae Walker and Jae Sevelius. I'm not going to tell you more. This is going to be on hold. We're here in New York City in the Cooper Union, waiting to start Horizons. And we're happy to be here. And we're queer. And how is it that we go?
We're here. We're queer.
Get used to it.
Get used to it.
Keep on following Chacruna Net. Bia Labate, big hug from New York City with Jae Sevelius.